Our hand trembles over the paper till our pen almost refuses to touch it, as the dear old memories of the sanctum comes back to us in the midst of an enemy's land. Those words were written over 140 years ago in a newspaper published by a group of soldiers who wanted to show their patriotism. They called it Stars and Stripes, after the beloved symbol they were fighting for, never knowing that what they started would someday become one of the most respected newspapers in the world. Today, Stars and Stripes links thousands of U.S. servicemen, women, and their families. It becomes their connection to the world, each other, and most of all, to home.
You could read about GIs, period. Not about officers, just about enlisted men, what they were doing and things like that.
Well, it brought up a lot of things of, well, stories about other servicemen in different war fronts that we didn't know very much about.
Everything that I knew about what was going on in the United States, I knew because of Stars and Stripes.
Union soldiers who published the first Stars and Stripes had no idea of the legacy they would leave. It was November 9th, 1861. They were sent to occupy the small town of Bloomfield, Missouri. The Civil War had turned 10 former newspapermen into soldiers.
And one of the things we found, of course, was an abandoned, temporarily abandoned newspaper office. And so in an all-night session in November of 1861, they did something that's really quite remarkable. In the midst of difficult times, they printed a newspaper.
It was a 4-page tabloid with stories about the military, the town, and an editorial column that spoke of the pain of war. It read, "We should all remember that we have not started out to destroy a country, but to save
one. That we are fighting neither for fun or glory, but for God and our rights."
Today in Bloomfield, at the Stars and Stripes Museum, copies of original newspapers are on exhibit for visitors to read. The museum was created in 1991 by a group of local veterans who wanted to commemorate the newspaper in the place of its birth. The museum has taken the Frontline Soldiers newspaper and turned it into an historical chronicle of the U.S. at war. Here, visitors can experience the Civil War. World War I. World War II. Korea. Vietnam. The Gulf War. And Kosovo. Every year, thousands of visitors pass through this museum, viewing a multitude of artifacts and photographs.
Well, I'll be darned, General Eisenhower said after learning President Harry Truman had fired General Douglas MacArthur.
Researchers of all ages use the museum resources. This group is trying to understand why 10 stripers died on the front line.
Well, General Grant heard about that, and he sent an opposing force, and they actually came from 3 spots.
Stars and Stripes correspondents risked their own safety to tell their stories firsthand on the battlefield. Some of the most famous are cartoonist Bill Malden, Superman comic creator Jerry Siegel, and 60 Minutes correspondents Andy Rooney and Steve Kroft.
I consider it my first job in journalism. It was a highly respected newspaper, and you could come back from the United States and with that on your resume, it showed that you knew what you were doing.
If you asked any soldier who was sent overseas in World War II what the next best thing to a letter from home was, he'd tell you the Stars and Stripes. One of the 2 or 3 luckiest things that have happened to me in my lucky life was being taken out of the field artillery as a truck driver and being assigned to the Stars and Stripes as a reporter. I learned how to be a newspaper man, I learned how to be a reporter, and I learned a lot about how to write. I was the least experienced of any of the people on the staff there, and there were some great newspaper men willing to share their knowledge of the business with me. They were great to me. Many of them had worked for the best newspapers in the country. When the name Dwight Eisenhower comes up in any conversation within my hearing, I almost always break in with an opinion of how great he was. He was a competent general and a good president, but he was more than that to us on the Stars and Stripes. He was great. He was our defender, our security blanket. He made it possible for us to be a good newspaper by protecting us from every petty major, colonel, or brigadier general who tried to influence the content of our paper. Everyone in charge of a lot of men, a regiment, a battalion, a division, wanted to get that organization's name in the Stars and Stripes, whether it was newsworthy or not. It was partially for the morale of the men, but could also help that officer with a promotion. Eisenhower absolutely refused to let us be influenced by anything but what was legitimate news. He allowed us to be professional newsmen, not propagandists. He somehow understood, I don't know how this happened, but he knew that the Stars and Stripes had to be a newspaper that the GIs could trust. Eisenhower knew they wouldn't trust it if officers were able to influence its content, and he would not allow it. When General Patton objected to some of Bill Malden's cartoons that made fun of him through a pearl-handled, pistol-packing caricature of him, Patton came to the editor of the paper and demanded that if Malden wasn't fired and sent back to the infantry, distribution of the Stars and Stripes would be banned among Third Army units. That was maybe 100,000 men, a lot. When Eisenhower learned of this, he told Patton, whom he'd known at West Point and sort of a friend, treated him more like a bad boy than like the pompous ass that Patton was, to mind his own business and keep his hands off the Stars and Stripes. At its peak, the Stars and Stripes had a circulation of 2 million. It was the Bible, Reader's Digest, hometown newspaper, and Playboy to the soldiers who read it.
Other famous correspondents who contributed to Stars and Stripes are Ernie Pyle, Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow, and Joyce Kilmer, who wrote the poem Trees. Kilmer died fighting in World War I. For now, it's a small museum, with more papers and artifacts than there is room to display. But plans are underway to expand to a new 20,000 square foot site.
We plan that to be a state-of-the-art, very modern museum. And in that 20,000 square feet, we think we can recreate much of the atmosphere that the writers saw and felt, and many of the things that the soldiers who read the paper saw and felt.
We think we're on a good location. We consider ourselves midway between St. Louis and Memphis. Branson is roughly 300 miles. We're out in the country, but it is easy to get here. And we're in the center of America.
Today, at the Stars and Stripes Museum, as visitors look through the exhibits and leaf through 140 years of newspapers, it's clear that the correspondents who worked for Stars and Stripes had the same idea in mind. To them, it was all about the morale of the U.S. soldiers who counted on them and the sacrifices that were made in the name of freedom.
I think the Stars and Stripes plays a very important role in telling the story of the American military and the American soldier. And so all of those people who have served in the military, who have had access to the Stars and Stripes, millions of them, literally, have a way of looking back to their past, to remember those stories, to remember those events that they were a part of, and so that they don't forget, and that their children and grandchildren, and that the American nation never forgets the sacrifices and the dedication they made in some of our most challenging and traumatic times.
In World War I, General John J. Pershing said of Stars and Stripes, "I do not believe that any one factor could have done more to sustain the morale of the American Expeditionary Forces than Stars and Stripes."
We were sitting in a bunker, and it was Christmas time, and we were reading the Stars and Stripes.
My most fondest memory of Stars and Stripes was the sports section.
They had good enlisted men who were writing the articles, and they were up front. They wasn't sitting in the back telling. They were up on the line, and they weren't fairly decent.
Yeah, they weren't like the war correspondents.
They were very
Some of these
decent.
dudes were actually in the service, so they were there.
They were
Like
fairly
Bill Malden.
decent.
Bill Malden went up front. Ernie Powell went up front.
Stars and Stripes was, for me, the link with home.
What we would like this museum to be is actually the headquarters of the Stars and Stripes, to serve the memory of those who've written for the Stars and Stripes and all those who've read the Stars and Stripes and been affected by them.
We've had veterans leave here with tears in their eyes.